an element of the Monarch program is the complete and total mind control. And, with that, it gets into the building of alters, which are alter personalities, where, they're going to be segmenting the mind into, like, the easiest way to describe it is like a file system. You have, let's just say you have 4 drawers. Each of those drawers are going to be given a different name. So one of the things, like with the doll programming, just for example, what they would start with was the Thumbelina. That drawer is going to be connected to a spiritual entity, an altar, like an actual physical altar that would be sacrificed on, because they're going to make the contract with the spiritual entity. So it's not just that they're splitting the mind or trying to control the mind.
Aloha and welcome to another show, guys. I'm really glad you're here today because we are peeling back the layers on a dark and disturbing topic: doll programming. Joining me once again is my returning guest and friend, Jessie Czebotar, a survivor and truth teller who brings rare firsthand insights into hidden systems that most people have never even heard of. In this episode, we dive deep into doll programming while also touching on related systems like mannequin, toy soldier, and monarch programming. Jessie helps us to understand how these systems operate. Please note that this conversation may be difficult for some listeners, so listener discretion is advised. If you or someone you care about has experienced this kind of trauma, know that you're not alone. There are people like Jessie who are actively helping survivors heal and reclaim their lives. You can learn more about her work and find resources at kingdomlivingwithjessie.com. Before we dive in, don't forget to follow the show, subscribe, and hit that notification bell so you never miss an episode. You can also support the show and access exclusive ad-free content over on Patreon. If you'd like to support the show, you can make a donation through Patreon or buy me a coffee. If you know someone who could benefit from this conversation, please share this episode with them. Now, let's welcome Jessie to the conversation. Enjoy the show. Hello, Jessie, and welcome back. It's a pleasure to have you back again. I always love our conversation, and today we're going to explore something that we haven't fully touched on before: doll programming. I know many of our listeners are familiar with terms like MKUltra or the Monarch. We talked about that before, but this is more specific, like a specific branch that I think doesn't get talked about much. So I'd love for you to walk us into doll programming, what it really is, where it starts, how it's used, what makes it different from other programmings that we've discussed.
Yeah, so I think, like, when we begin, it's good to kind of just talk about the structure of programming. And, the system is notorious for using symbols, images, all to represent what they're doing. At face front, everything just looks like random images. It all, looks like it's very disconnected or uncoordinated, but it really is a collaborated effort. So, it's important to start with, the image of the Monarch program. Monarch program is the overall name of the system's program. And, the image is actually fivefold, but most people would see it fourfold because they usually show an image of a monarch or a butterfly, and you've got the kind of, the wings sectioned off into 4 sections. The 5th section is actually seen as the head and the body. Um, so, going back to, this goes all the way back to centuries. But the common denominator of the program is that, you know, the system needed to ensure that it kept going. So each generation, you know, there's individuals that they're going to raise up who are going to be in charge of teaching the foundational frame of the system to the next generation so that it continues on. And how they did that usually was that, you know, they would choose one person that would know the entirety of the programs, meaning, you know, what are the programs, who's overseeing those programs, and um you know, who has the pieces that they're overseeing. And they would safeguard it, you know, this way where, you know, there would only be one person that would know the entirety, and then they would um you know, have four other individuals that each would have a piece based on what was their sphere or scope of training. So therefore you had then where, you know, the whole thing was divided into four parts. um, each of those four parts having an element that is going to be run through the regional departments of the system that are working in connection to the educational system. So you had it split into, you know, four parts that were divvied up between the Masons, the Mormons, the Jesuit Catholic, the Kabbalah, and the Satanists. Therefore, there was a blend between, you know, religion, the home life, and the educational system. And all of that, you know, operating in, they're training the children up in the ways that they should go according to, you know, what they're chosen to do in the system. And yet, you know, it nobody understands the wholeness of what's happening. They just think, oh, we have our home life, we have our church life, and we have our education, but not understanding that all of that is working together in order to train, program, or MKUltra the hierarchy children being born into the brotherhood system. So that's the purpose of Monarch, is, you know, to basically be that um, unseen entity that, you know, is connecting all those pieces of the training, the programming, and the MK Ultra. So based on, you know, what position the children are chosen for in the system is going to, you know, depend on what is their training, what are the programs they're going to be involved in, and does that training or programs include MK Ultra. So there's an aspect of this that, you know, that kind of crosses spheres, because, you know, a bulk of the training that happens is all based, you know, it's based on just teaching a child what they're supposed to do, how they're supposed to act. You have things like, you know, manners, etiquette, you know, being a good steward of your school, you know, doing chores, living life. All of those became avenues of just teaching or training a child up. You know, when you go to church, here's how you act, here's what you do. Now that happens both in their cover life as well as in, you know, their brotherhood roles. You know, they're gonna, you know, whoever's doing their training is gonna model for them, you know, if you're in this situation, here's how you act. So training is more natural. It's usually done by example. It includes Kabbalah knowledge, which is passed on orally. Um, so all of that, you know, is more of a natural aspect of the teaching within that monarch training versus, you know, programs are, you know, the program part. that could be two ways. You have projects or programs that, children will participate in. It could include experiments. You know, think about things like vaccines, where, those were going big. They were monitoring the health of the children. With the programs, you're going to have usually a specialist who's overseeing. You're going to have a monitoring aspect to it. There's going to be feedback. They're wanting to see what's happening. How do you feel? How is this impacting you? Um, so there'll be more people involved, whether that's in the school, whether that's through the military, or, if that's through your church. You'd get it even with some of the priests that were involved, where how are they going to monitor? How are they going to control? How are they going to figure out and assess how you're doing? A lot of times that's going to come through confession. You're going to go for appropriations, and you're going to confess, and that's how they're going to know, is the teaching working or not? Are they getting the moral and the ethical results that they want in your cover life? Or are you struggling with those things? What are the struggles? Well, now you're going to confess them in order to be right with God. And they're going to give you tasks, things that you have to do to right the areas where you're out of compliance, right? So, you know, if that's not working, well, then they also had the virtue squad, which are going to be, the older women in the church, um, the secretaries, those who always have eyes, the nuns at the school or teachers, those who are going to, remind you that, you don't speak unless you're spoken to, or when you enter the library, you must be quiet. Um, you know, and they're going to give you the rules. They're going to direct you when you're out of compliance and give you that chance to come back into compliance. Now, if you don't, well, then they're going to put into effect the secondary um, compliance, uh, punishments, which, for me as a child, and many other children, that would include, usually pits, or, being locked in a basement, being locked under the staircases. They would isolate, separate you, so that you have time to think, about what you're not doing right. And you have time to pray, and you have time to get right with God, which basically was all their wording that would be focused on, controlling your cover life. You need to have that emotional capacity to control yourself and self regulate. They're not going to do it for you, but they certainly will put you into situations that are conducive to that self emotional and physical regulation, even to the point of, tying down or whatever they need to do to get that child under control. And, if that's not enough, then they're going to take more drastic measures to make sure you're silent and that you aren't telling things that aren't supposed to be told. So, all of that connected with your, what would be more considered programs, because, there's going to be a more, um, it kind of goes across programs and training, but, in that they're ultimately wanting you to come to the conclusions, you to make the choice. It's your will how you're going to act and behave, and how you're going to respond. So all of that is different from then the next phase of the programs, which is um, the MK Ultra. And with that, it's not your choice. It's not your will. Even, forced choice is different than the MK Ultra because they're going to, be more evasive in it, and they're going to usurp any will that you or choice that you may have. They're just going to get in there and they're going to get control. And that can start at a very young age. The earliest doll programming begins usually around age 2 to 4, and that's the Thumbelina programming. So, with that, it's common for the programming to be associated with stories, and that became a way that they could easily cover if a child's talking, even a young child, if they start bringing out the name Thumbelina and people are like, what is she talking about? Why is she bringing that out? Then it gets to, oh, I shared a story with her. We read the story of Thumbelina. Um, but in that program, it's about giving that person who's going to be controlling that child, um, access. And so, um, an element of the Monarch program is the complete and total mind control. And with that, it gets into the building of alters, which are alter personalities, where they're going to be segmenting the mind into, like, the easiest way to describe it is like a file system. You have, let's just say you have 4 drawers. Each of those drawers are going to be given a different name. um so one of the things, like with the doll programming, just for example, what they would start with was the Thumbelina, and that that drawer is going to be connected to a spiritual entity, an altar, like an actual physical altar that would be sacrificed on, because they're going to make the contract with a spiritual entity. So it's not just that they're splitting the mind or trying to control the mind. The purpose is to give control to a spiritual entity in this, um, for whatever they're purposing in the system. So, so they're going to, next, after they'll have a main principality that's then connected to the oversight of the drawer itself. So only those who, have connection to that entity or spirit can gain access. Well, then, as the drawers opened up, they're going to start putting files in there. Each of those files are going to be connected to a traumatic experience. And each is separate within itself. It becomes its own memory, all separated from the other memories within that drawer. Um, each an experience that, you know, they can choose what's going to be part of the conscious memory, what's part of the subconscious memory. And all of those, each of those files can be connected to additional entities that will oversee that file. So um, with the Thumbelina, the purpose was basically, in a nutshell, to, you know, create, begin to create the disassociation. Thumbelinas were usually silent. They wouldn't fight when it's triggered. The child sees herself or himself as a baby doll, where they're innocent, they're not able to do anything. And usually the trauma would be sexual assault. And it was common for that initial sexual assault to be with the father, um, where you'd have that's part of it, the father gaining control of the daughter or the son. through that sexual assault. So then every time that alter's brought up, um, the child becomes very, becomes silent, doesn't fight, just lays there, experiences what happens, but, has no control to react in the situation. So that was kind of the initial one. Um, then from there, you get, based on the seasons, the times, you get other doll programs that are going to be brought in. Um, some of the more, common ones are going to be like you've got your Tiger Lily program. That is going to be connected with those that, that they're, maybe let's put it this way, there's a connection with that in your Order of the Red Men. Um, that gets into some of the programs that operate out of the Pacific Islands and the Palisades, California base, which in connection to those, you have an area that they're going to call Neverland. So it gets into the Peter Pan stories and brings in the Walt Disney movies where they bring in the character, the Tiger Lily, the chief's daughter, um, and the connection with Peter Pan, the Lost Boys, the mermaids, all of that imagery is then brought into that. There'll be certain times and seasons that you're going to have the programming occur. Like usually, like in the fall, you get another that's not quite the same, it's similar to the base doll programs, but you get programs like the Tin Man programming. That's going to get into the characters of the Wizard of Oz, where, you've got the good witches, the bad witches. You've got Dorothy, who's got, power on her own to get places. And in that, the Tin Man program is, they're told that they have no heart, which really is to impact any emotional or ethical morals that a child would have, especially a male child, when they're in that role of Tin Man. Um, they don't have a heart, they're not seen as human. And that was one of the like initial aspects that then, like the Tin Man program, then funneled into some of the more super soldier programs with the MKUltra. Where initially you either were the Tin Man, you were the Scarecrow, or you were the Lion. All of those having different characteristics that they would bring out to children that were being, programmed together. The Scarecrow, was one that, um, also was seen as not, would see themselves as not human, would, you know, all of a sudden lose strength because they're not flesh, they don't have bones. Um, versus your lion would be seen as, a scaredy cat, but then all of a sudden is confident and brave. And all of that had to do with situations that they would put the children in, um, basically in creating them to be, super assassins, where, if you're a Tin Man, you're not, you see yourself as, you know, immortal, and you can take whatever and it's not going to impact you because you're not human, right? So, that's where you get the superhuman strength in some of these situations, or those that are, assassins that are, no matter how many bullets you put in them, they're going to still keep coming, to fulfill the job. It's because in their mind, they see themselves as something other than human, and that construct, keeps them going because there isn't any fear there of death or anything. Um, so those were some of the initial, and then, your mannequin programs was another line that became very similar to the MKUltra, the superhumans, but that, that one stemmed from um, some of the sorcery and the journeys that they would put the knights through. You have, some of the initial training for those that are sovereign military knights is that they have to complete journeys. So as they enter into the sovereign military as a knight, they're defining themselves according to equilibrium within the system. According to the equilibrium, there always has to be, the two sides where you have one that's going to be considered good, one that's, considered light or the sun, one that, is considered male, um, and that has to do with the giving or the receiving of energy, one that's considered fire magic versus you have the other that's considered, the feminine, the weaker, yet even though, they can still be strong in that, but, um, you know, one that operates off the blue light spectrum versus the yellow light spectrum of magic. So more the water magic, more the nighttime magic. Um, that one is usually considered the female, can receive versus the other gives out energy. So all of that, as children enter the training in the programs, they're going to be defining, where they fall into that. And so, your mannequin program stemmed from, as your kids would go to some of the different training areas, one of the common ones were uh, the islands of Malta. And there they would have to visit with the oracles. It goes along the stories of Hercules. Um, they see themselves as Hercules. They have certain objectives that they're given. Um, God forbid they run into Medusa in that. And what does Medusa do? Turns children into stone. That initially, was where the mannequin program stemmed out of, those that were stone, and basically then subject to, whoever the Medusa, whoever the controlling sorceress is, they're controlled by that sorceress. Um, they come to life when they're given commands. Usually those commands revolve around killing, and then they're stone again. No life in them. So um, in that, there's also a built-in freeze program, that if you're looked at, you're frozen. You're not going to move as long as you're looked at. The moment you're not looked at, you can move. So same with the mannequins, have that built-in freeze and move programming. So they'll be given an objective, but there's regulations with it um, that control that objective. So,
That's crazy. I've never heard of so many different programmings. My goodness. Um,
yeah, there's more. It's absolutely crazy.
it's ridiculous. Is this through the military or
Both. It's the upper levels of the system. Um, like you had Gloria Vanderbilt was one. She, she used her dollhouses for divination. So that's one where they teach how to, use the dollhouses to create scenarios, to make things, will things to happen between the physical and the spiritual worlds. Um, in that you also had, she would teach classes on the making of China dolls. They would usually teach girls how to make the China doll face mask. But that's a whole nother program. You get the China doll face, and those that are very beautiful but very fragile. So, if the face gets broken, then there's things that happen. So that became a whole program where you get the very fragile, and um, if your face gets broken or shattered, then that dealt with your soul and the imagery of losing control, not having authority or power. Um, you know, um, that would also be used in connection with initial rituals where, you'd always have to hide your face. So they'd have the kids make their own masks, and you'd have to, keep your face hidden in spite of whatever was happening at the ritual. Um, yeah, so there's just so many. They have the Russian dolls too, where you end up with layer upon layer upon layer of hidden, personalities. Just when you think you found the one, there's more, and it gets down to how many can they create in a person, how many splits can they do in the mind. Um,
That's, that's crazy and creepy too.
yeah.
Is there, I guess, a spiritual demonic entity often associated with doll programming, or each programming is a different?
Yeah, you have the kind of the main four hidden, which are going to go back to your uh, main Egyptian gods, which are, Ra, Ashtaroth. They give when they refer to her in connection to the Egyptian, it's going to be Ma. So you have O, Ma, Ra, and Set. O being Anuk. Um, and then, so those are the main four that they're going to hide in programming, and they're recognized only by the colors that they're connected to. So you'll see it in the layout of the base Rosicrucian cross with the rose. You'll see a rose with the very inner layer. In the inner layer, you'll see the yellow, the red, and the blue. That goes back to those Egyptian gods in that first layer of program, which is the Oma Ra Set. Um, then you have the next layer, it's going to connect to Ashtaroth, and then usually Abaddon and Leviathan. And then you'll start to get the subletting into other additional principalities like Baal, Molech, Baphomet, Azazel, Toth, and Samael are kind of the next layers. And then from there, they'll continue to layer based on, what areas you're in, which commanders under those principalities, whose authority are you going to be under? So they may get into specifics with that, but yeah.
Are are there public figures or characters in pop culture that you believe exhibit signs of doll programming?
Um, yeah, there are some. Definitely, I would say, where we would see it more, like your classic, you had a lot of the uh, kids that were involved, let's say, with your Mickey Mouse Club, or Disney, right? Where, um, in their initial, they start their careers young, they're seen as innocent, they're all involved in very family friendly things and wholesome things. And then all of a sudden they hit 18, and all of a sudden there's a switch, and you're like, what the heck? Like now they're erotic, they're doing things that you know, are blatant and in your face, and you're like, what in the world happened? I think those are good examples of, that doll program happening where, you have somebody that's controlling them, somebody that's setting the narrative. All that we see is the good cover life that they're all going by. Um, but then, as soon as they turn 18, they begin to choose, what they want, what they're going to display. And I think that shows, either their good side or their dark side.
Hey Ohana, I hope you're loving this conversation as much as I am. I just wanted to pause for a quick moment to ask for your support. If you're enjoying what you're hearing and feel like we've earned it, we'd be so grateful if you could leave us a rating or review. Your honest feedback really helps us grow and reach more people who love exploring these fascinating topics. And if you think this episode would resonate with someone you know, don't forget to share it with them. Mahalo nui loa for being part of our journey. Now, back to the show.
Their dark side.
Are there any triggers commonly used to activate or reinforce these doll programming people?
Yeah. I think some of the ones that they would use, especially like, I would say like in the Disney or some of those, you'd get color triggers. So the change in lighting, um, like if all of a sudden things went, and we see this even happening in homes now. Think about how we used to all have light bulbs that were a yellow spectrum. And all of a sudden, all the light bulbs change, and now everything is according to the blue spectrum. Why is that, right? We don't even think about stuff like that. So you'd get lighting changes, which, could even include things with red light. A lot of your exit signs were specifically made with red lights, not to help you find the exit better, but to trigger, um, if you had kids that were trying to get away or get out, that red light would all automatically make some of them pause and become very fearful. They may not even know why, but they would hesitate and be very fearful to, you know, they would start looking for, is there another way out? Um, because there would just be a natural fear that would be triggered with that red light. So lighting was something that would often be used. Sound, sometimes basic hypnosis techniques like, finger snaps or pen clicks. Um, teachers would, teachers, whether in the school or in the churches, you would get the pen clicks, or the tapping of the pencils was a huge one that they would use in that, or the rulers, where they would tap the rulers against the desk or the back of the chair, all of that to trigger um, certain things, that control.
Wow. Are there known locations like schools or elite clubs or training centers where doll programming is concentrated?
Yeah, I think, the area of Chicago, that military base was a big one that was known for that. Uh, for the initial, because it's going to depend on, your kind of, I've broken down the training where you have your main military bases that are going to do the initial training, but they're going to work in connection with schools. So you're going to get all those working with the elementary or the preschools, the big areas with those that are going to be involved at some level. But, you know, so I would put that as in, the main few that I've named: your Palisades, California, You're going to have your Chicago, Illinois military base underground. You're going to have the three bases that are considered Ragnarok, which is going to be your South Pole. And then the northern Ragnaroks are the Aleutian Islands, Alaska, and the Greenland military base. And then you're going to have Carderock Naval War Center. At Carderock, they're going to more outsource that, in that area because it's the Eastern Quadrant. You get a connection to the Grand High Priestesses of the East, which, when I was a kid, you had Gloria Vanderbilt, Laurie Cabot Kent. So those were kind of the big individuals who were doing it in that area. Yeah.
Do these programs, like the doll program, are they in specific bloodlines? Or is this like random? They just.
Yeah, I think it goes, that's a great question, but from what I experienced, it doesn't matter, what bloodline you're from in the hierarchy. A hierarchy child is just someone who's born into the system and they've, decided that you're going to have some position in the system, even though it might not be defined yet. They've chosen you to help continue the system on. And then within that, they're going to start to define your bloodline, not necessarily based on what family name you come from, but those family names go back to your tribes of Israel. And you may or may not actually come from those tribes. They're just going to stick you in a house, and that house is going to be defined by the name of a tribe of Israel. Further back, it's going to connect to, which Israel mother are they putting you under? Rachel, Leah, or one of the two maid servants. That's really what's behind that. And all of that's going to connect to your cherubic sign that they put you under initially, which is going to go to, the eagle in the north, the lion in the east, the sign of the man in the south, or the, farm animal, the sign of the ox in the west. So that's, and all of that gets into, your elemental magical abilities and where they're going to stick you in the circle groups that you're in. So that's kind of how it's defined in the system. So certainly, any child that's chosen kind of to play that escort role in the system, whether low level or high level escort, um, they're more likely to get the doll programming. Certainly anybody chosen for MKUltra programs to be super soldiers. We've talked a little bit about the Voice of God project and how connected to that project, you have two super soldier groups. The one being the Alpha Warriors, the other being the Omega Warriors. The Alpha are going to be in charge of prepping times, seasons, and events for end time things, making sure things are in place for when those times come. And then your Theta Warriors being those that are going to, be called up when it's time for those events, and they'll be participating in those events. So those super soldier programs, both the Alpha and the Theta, they have an element of that, doll programming as well, even though they're not going to call it, they'll classify it under MKUltra, meaning they're specifically trained with, not just escort, but you get the warrior aspect to the dolls as well, which goes back to like how they classified it in the old days, was the dolls were more connected to your wives, those that would be parts of the breeder program, your wives, your princesses, your queens, all of those would be classified as, the women that were going to be married into or married to for the purpose of producing hierarchy children. And then you have, your priestesses, which are more connected to your escorts. They're going to be servicing, providing that sexual pleasure. Then you get where there's a intermix with that, with, some were then used for assassins, where they would, train them in the different CIA assassin programs. Um, but then that, so you had your doll programs, which mostly dealt with, the breeder programs and the escort services. And then you had your toy soldier program, which is originally what the MKUltra was you would get those that were just, they were programmed basically to go into war, whatever it was, and to basically die. Um, their job was to be a soldier, and whoever controlled them, dictated whether they lived or died. Um, and you do, interestingly enough, you get the imagery. There's a mural of the toy soldiers in the Halloween room at Biltmore.
Ooh, is
Yeah.
that
So you get a,
good?
that initially, like, you had a program that dealt with both the dolls and the soldiers, known as the Nutcracker. And, they came out with that imagery of the Nutcracker. And then the doll program for that, they called the ballerina program. And you had the toy soldiers in there too, where the toy soldiers' job was to protect, to help save, to rescue. Um, yeah, so
Wow. Yeah, to me, it seems like I'm not saying all ballerinas. I'm not saying that, but the ballet program, especially the ones that are really rigid in Russia, from what you
mhm,
see in movies anyway, and how they train you is very rigorous. And it's like
yeah,
a doll-like program, it seems like, because they have to be a certain way.
mhm,
Wow.
yeah.
So these doll program, I thought initially it was more for maybe entertainment or politics, but it can be used for anything.
For anything, yeah, for anything. So,
Wow. And how are these doll identity maintained over time? Are there handlers involved or are there other self?
from my understanding, initially they had, those in the system that were classified as programmers, so they would be the ones initiating the program. Um, and then, from my understanding, and a lot of this comes from Cisco Wheeler, who was the top programmer in the system. Um, she has a book, The Total Mind Control Program. You can look that up by Cisco Wheeler and Fritz Springmeier. She gets into some of the programs in there. Um, but it seemed like the average programs were, what they found was that they would stick if they, were initiated well. They would usually stick for 30 years, and then around the 30-year mark, they would begin to break down. The person would start to have memories, puzzle pieces coming up, flashbacks, and that's when they would have to, they initiated, put into place, um, the ISSTD therapists, who then became those who managed those who had been programmed. And, there would be a reprogramming that would take place. And then from there, it still seemed like the reprograms, stick about 30 years. And then, if the reprogram did not stick, that's where you had the mental health services put into place, because you'd have people that, literally would be like they were crazy, and they would put them into the asylums, they would medicate them, silence them, and shut them up so that they weren't, um, compromising the system or the structure of the system.
Wow, I never saw this movie, but is doll programming, I guess, in a woman would look something like a Stepford Wife, the show or that movie,
You
Stepford
could,
Wife?
yeah, for those that like, that would be under like where we talked about that they can be, you know, that would be used to, for them to be used in breeding, so as wives, as um, queens, as princesses. Yeah, you'd get kind of that Stepford wife type feel, creepy vibe. Yeah.
Wow. What about dolls like Barbie and things like that? Are these used on purpose, for like these doll programming for girls to look perfect, to be perfect?
Yeah, and it wasn't necessarily even the perfect look. It's a form of perfectionism, and it binds them under the sin, usually connected to gluttony. But you've got the reverse of gluttony, which is anorexia or bulimia, where it's a self-destruct program that, they're going to not even realize they're doing damage to their body. And, you know, it's basically that self-destruction.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So what would someone look for either in someone else or even themselves if they've been programmed? I mean, is there certain signs that they can see?
Not necessarily, because they're all designed where you've got that cover life. Um, and most of it is so good that, you don't even notice anything, which that then becomes sometimes the biggest foreteller. Um, how do you know the kids that have been in the system? Usually the one identifying mark is the perfectionism. These are your perfect families, your perfect kids. They excel in school, they excel in sports and all these other extracurricular activities, including church. They have time for it all, and they're the best of the best. Usually, those are your kids and your families that are in the system. Um, you know, and so, that perfectionism becomes the mark, that form of godliness, where even they've got that relationship with God, they pray everything, right? Um, in conjunction with those that have extreme night terrors. That's the other one, is the nightmares and the night terrors. Um, because usually they're being either called up at night, or there's stuff happening in the spirit world at night, um, or they're having memories surface during those times. Yeah.
So when you say night terrors, is that when you get frozen in bed and can't get up?
That's paralyzation, which that can go hand in hand with the nightmares and the night terrors. But two different things. So nightmares is going to be, where you're getting the horrific dreams. Um, Night terrors is those that are going to, like, they'll kind of enter into state. They may even be physically active. So like they could be, walking at night. They could be getting out of the house. Um, but the biggest thing, like with the night terrors, is they'll just, they won't be responsive, but they'll sit up in bed, they'll be screaming these horrific screams, they'll be terrified, but they're asleep. And, you've got to try to break them out of that, wake them up. So that's more the night terrors.
I see. Yeah, like a Nightmare on Elm Street kind of thing.
Yeah, and the paralyzation would be where they, they can't move. Sometimes they can't breathe. They stop breathing in their sleep, which is different. I think there's an aspect to sleep apnea that connects with that. And then you can get the actual, those who are getting physical demonic attacks when they sleep. Um, that can play a role in that as well.
Wow. You mentioned red men uh, in the Pacific region. What is that?
The Order of the Red Men is considered one of the more ancient orders of the Brotherhood. So you can look them up, and usually, it has nothing to do with Native Americans, even though they're going to use that symbology in that order. But they're going to usually be involved in politics. The way that they structure that order, they take a lot of the Native American things or imagery. You have positions like Pocahontas, which is going to be the individual within that order who schedules the meetings, tells everybody where the meetings are at. And they work hand in hand with your knights group called the Sons of Liberty.
Oh, there's so many different branches within branches within branches. It's crazy.
Yeah.
I don't know how you keep it straight. Oh my goodness.
There's a lot.
There is. Neverland. That reminded me of Michael Jackson. Isn't that what his place was called? The Neverland or something like that?
I don't know about that, but that'd be interesting, huh?
Yeah, because he was liked children and he acted like a child. And I think his place in California, he called it the Neverland, I thought. I know. Weird. I know.
Yeah.
A lot of these missing children, are they part of these programs or not? I guess some.
Not necessarily.
Okay.
Yeah, you're
These are
more, I think,
specific
like you're
people.
missing children like you would see in connection with those like that you see up in the signs at Walmart
Mhm.
or things. I think those are going to be more your expendable children that are used for rituals or for sexual exploitation within the system.
Okay.
Yeah.
Wow. Now, if someone has been in this one of these programs, how do you get out of it? Is there a way to break free? How can they break free? Where do they get help?
There is, yeah. And, for me, I'm going to be a little unconventional here because, if you're going off of the specialist side, those that dealt with, you've got a whole aspect, the psychological aspect to that. And your specialists are going to tell you that only somebody who understands those things can deprogram or, um, help you get that under control, which usually is going to come through, you know, having somebody basically handle or control you. And usually that will be with medication and other things, which, I encourage people, pray, ask the Lord. The Lord knows the extent of what was done to you. He also knows the extent of what your body needs. So don't take my suggestion as medical advice. Look into it all, pray, and ask the Lord about it all. But with that said, all of those avenues, they never speak cure. They only speak of ways to manage. Um, you know, that's what you're going to get. You're going to get to manage symptoms. Um, I'm somebody who is a firm believer in the complete work of Christ. I know the work the Lord did in my life, and I see the Lord do the complete work in people's lives. Who created our mind, who knows everything about us, who, is the one who is the sovereign Lord over all things in our lives. It's Jesus Christ. So I'm a firm believer in the complete work of Christ. And within that, you have a component of, working through deliverance with the Lord. How does that look? It starts with 1 John 1:9, confess the sin. Sin is the enemy's only legal ground, and that's one thing that the system is big, is putting people into a place of sin, a state of unrighteousness. How do they get away with, attaching all these spirits, attaching all of that stuff that, comes on survivors? It's through sin, acts of sin, right? So, how do we remove the stronghold that the enemy has over us? And that's an important word in scripture. Um, what is the basis of these programs? It's all strongholds in the spiritual realm. It's all connection to spiritual entities, right? How do we deal with those? Scripture says that we have the authority to rebuke them. We have the authority to cast them out. Where do we start? It starts with that confession. When we confess our sins, according to 1 John 1:9, um, the Lord is faithful to cleanse us, and to remove all unrighteousness. So that puts us in a different state. Um, when that happens, when we confess, we are now restored to a state of righteousness, right standing before God. And in that state, we have authority in Christ. We have the authority to rebuke. We have the authority to bind. We have the authority to cast out. So that's where I start. And, by the time you're done working through all the things that the Lord shows you to work through, you're in that place of right standing and standing in your authority in Christ, fully dressed in your spiritual armor, which He gives to each of us. And with that, how are we standing in that armor? What does it say? Our loin is girded with truth. We have on the breastplate of righteousness. Our feet are shod with the gospel of peace. We have the helmet of salvation, that assurity that we know exactly where we're going. Um, we are saved. And with that, we have our shield of faith and our sword of the Spirit. And, we're able to stand against the evil one. What is the final outcome of that? It tells us in the book of Revelations, they overcame the evil one by the blood of the Lamb and the word of their testimony. That's really what this is about. When we manage symptoms, we lose out on going forward in the authority and the power of the blood of the Lamb and the word of our testimony. So that's why I put it those ways. I don't think there's anything too difficult for the Lord. He knows exactly, what each of us has gone through. He knows that, the damages that was caused to us, and He is able to heal. The Lord is our healer, and heal, restore, renew. Yet, with that said, there may be times that we can't deal with those strongholds alone. Find someone that, is going to promote your healing, that is going to be there alongside of you as you work through that journey if you have to. But, trust the Lord too. Don't, I guess my biggest thing with that is, don't subject yourself to the wisdom of men. We have a mighty Holy Spirit who can display His power. And if you need help walking through things, choose someone that is walking in that display of the Holy Spirit's power, not just in the wisdom of men.
Yeah. Yeah. Yes. Well, thank you so much, Jessie. I always appreciate your honesty, your depth, and your courage. Thank you. And for those who want to follow your work and to learn more, where's the best place where they can find you?
Yeah, you can find me on my website, kingdomlivingwithjessie.com. I encourage you to check that out. I've got a great new series, The Unveiling of the System, which, I'm breaking down the different aspects of how the system works and operates. Just yesterday, I had one of my newest episodes, The Princes of Jerusalem and the Councils, go up. I also have the Leviathan system, part 1 and 2, that just went up. So those are great for helping you understand, you know, what is this system? How is it working and operating at the quadrant and regional levels? How can I know? How can I recognize the signs, the symbols, and where it's working? So in those episodes, I really start to get into that. So I encourage you to check that out. On my website, you'll find my courses, the coachings that I have available. And I do have a great new workshop coming up in August here. Let me quick check. I think it's August 10th and 17th, 2 Thursday nights. But I'm going to start to get into decoding. Like we've talked a little bit about the structure of the buildings. I'm going to get further into the architecture and how the architecture connects to the altars, and how you can know by the architecture which deities and which altars they have available in the areas. So that's brand new up for people to sign up and register. That will be, again, August 10th and 17th. That's going to be packed with a lot of information. I also have another international land assignment. People can sign up to start to learn how to decode the crests, the different symbols that you would see internationally in the crests, what those mean, and that is July 26th. So lots
Wow.
of new stuff coming out.
Yes, yes. Well, thank you again, Jessie, for being with us and speaking so boldly. Your courage and clarity always bring steps to these conversations, and I know the listeners are going to walk away with a lot to think about. So thank you for
Thank
that.
you.
No, thank you. I want to give a heartfelt thank you to my special guest and friend, Jessie Czebotar, for coming on and sharing her powerful insights and lived experience.